I spent about 6 years incarcerated at the Substance Abuse Treatment Facility in Corcoran, California. SADF for short. SADF was a real corollary to High Desert State Prison, where I'd previously been incarcerated. High Desert was a tiny little slice of hell. It was violence, blood, gangs, racism, death. That's what I remember about High Desert. You walked out of the door to your cell, and every time you did, you knew that there were men with knives who were prepared to end your life and one another's life on principle. They had nothing to lose, and life meant very little. Corcoran was very different. Corcoran was a program prison, is what they called it. What they mean by that is the inmates that move there are programmers. They're going to work the program. They're interested in rehabilitating themselves, or at least appearing that they've rehabilitated themselves. They want a parole, or at least not get into any trouble. There were still fist fights, but there were no knives, no real violence. It was a pretty laid-back environment. And as a result, a lot of the inmates who were moved there would have had a hard time getting along anywhere else. There were a lot of rats there, a lot of transgender inmates, and a lot of elderly inmates. This is a story of an elderly inmate that I befriended while at SADF on a yard, named Rich Castile. At least I'm 90% sure his name was Rich. It honestly could have been Mitch or something else entirely. You see, he'd had a stroke. He could only speak through the corner of his mouth. And he was severely afflicted with Alzheimer's. He had difficulty expressing himself. He would get confused and frustrated very easily. So I wasn't sure as to his name, but he was okay being called Rich, and it seemed unkind to just ask him again and again, what did you say your name was? I do know his last name was Castile. I know this because it was posted on the outside of his bunk, and because whenever the inmates spoke to him, they referred to him as Inmate Castile. They do that. They turn your name into a title to dehumanize you and distance themselves from you as a person. Rich moved into the building, and I honestly didn't pay much mind to him, except that they had moved him into an outlier bunk. You see, on a yard, there's a large central day room. This is where there's a big TV for the inmates to watch sports, it's where there are tables for them to play games, and there are hallways offset from the day room. Each hallway has 14 bunks, all in a row. So if you are on the bunk closest to the day room, the outlier bunk, you're essentially in the day room. There are people playing dominoes or cards or arguing just 5 feet from where you sleep. The cops move people into these bunks, sometimes as a punishment to take away their privacy, or perhaps because they get caught making pruno and the cops want to keep an eye on them. They're prone to fighting. In Rich's case, I think it was because they were waiting for him to die. They knew he didn't have long to live, and they wanted to keep an eye on him. I noticed, shortly after Rich moved in, that he was trying to flag somebody down. He was trying to get somebody's attention. I went over and I asked him, "Hey, old-timer, you all right? You need something?" Rich couldn't speak very well, but he managed to partially mutter and partially sign that he needed help to get to the restroom, that he needed to pee. This was particularly sad because the restroom was 20 feet from where Rich slept. The cops had put him in the bunk closest to the common urinals. But I discovered that Rich had had a stroke that had paralyzed his left leg, his left arm, the left side of his body. So it was really difficult for him to move around. I gave him an arm and helped him up and kind of walked him to the restroom, and it turned out this turned what was a 10-minute ordeal for him into just a minute or so of walking there and back. He was understandably grateful, and I didn't mind. I mean, who wouldn't do that just as an act of common decency for an elderly individual? The problem was that Rich didn't need to use the restroom one time. He needed to use the restroom 15, 20 times a day. So I started setting up my textbooks and my CD player and whatever things I was going to use that day at the table closest to his bunk. So I was only about 5, maybe 10 feet away from where he slept. And that way he'd be able to flag me down and let me know that he needed to use the restroom, or if he needed something else I could help him with it. And the situation continued, and I'm embarrassed about some things in my life where I could have been a better person, and this is one of them. Over the course of a week or 2 or 3 weeks, I stopped being quite as generous in helping him. I still did it, but I really wished somebody else would take him to the restroom, that the staff would fix it, that it wasn't my problem. And there were occasions where I pretended I didn't see that he needed help, or perhaps made a snarky comment about it. That was a terrible thing for me to do. I should have been more generous in my helping Rich. But I did keep helping him for the 3 weeks or so it took for me to get medical to pay attention to his problem. And they gave him a catheter. Once medical gave Rich a catheter, his relationship and mine, we got along a lot better. He didn't need quite so much from me. He needed my help 5 times a day instead of 20 times a day, which was much easier for me to deal with. Eventually, Rich was allowed to go to Canteen. He had some money on his books, and he was going to be allowed to purchase some goodies. However, the temperature outside at this point in summer in Corcoran was 100 and something degrees, 105, 107 most days, and it would take 2 hours to get your canteen. Given Rich's health problems, it seemed cruel at best to expect him to stand outside for 2 hours. So I spoke to some people I knew. I spoke to the inmates that worked in the canteen manager, a couple of cops, and we arranged that he was just going to be escorted to and from the canteen that day. It wouldn't take him 10 minutes. While he was being escorted to the canteen, I noticed that he had some large white crystals in his catheter tube. On reflection now, I know these are called urea crystals, and it's not too uncommon. At the time, I thought that he was dying. He had crystals that he was urinating. And I told the officer, I said, hey, we need to get this guy some medical attention. He needs some help. That's not normal. And I remember the officer, he and I were on good terms. That's why he was doing me this favor. He wasn't a bad cop. He cared. He tried to make the place a better place. And he looked at me and he said, Channel, why are you bothering? Why are you bothering? That wasn't just his attitude. I realize now that it was the attitude of everybody but me. Just let the old man die. Why are you bothering to make his problems everybody's problems? That's what dying in prison is. That's what dying in prison is. A couple of weeks later, Rich called me over. He had a question. He needed to talk to me. I said, hey, Rich, what do you need? He muttered, and I asked him to repeat himself, and he asked, Aaron, what happened? I told him, Rich, you had a stroke. It made it so that it's hard for you to move around. You're sick now, but it'll be okay. He got frustrated, and he kind of clenched, and no, what happened? Why am I here? He didn't remember why he was in prison. I don't think he was sure as to where he was, that this was prison. That's what dying in prison is. I know a lot of criminals, a lot of outlaws think that they're tough and they're ready to serve their time. They think of dying in prison as standing strong against an unfair society, or going out in a hail of bullets. Or even, being in prison and being in a gang and maybe getting stabbed or something like that, or getting old and dying in their sleep. The reality of dying in prison is that you age slowly. Your family forgets about you and they die. Your friends forget about you and they die. And you're alone. And the years go on, and you get sicker and older, and your brain starts to go until you're not sure why you're there. That's what dying in prison is. Dying in prison is having to beg a stranger to help you pee. Dying in prison having the cops ask, why bother? And then you do die. It's a sad, pathetic way to go. I got moved from a yard about 2 weeks later. Unrelated issues. I don't know when Rich died, but I know that he was alone when he did it. I know that nobody cared about him. That's why you don't want to go to prison. That's why you don't want to die in prison. It's because you will be alone and forgotten about. Don't go to prison.